Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed Ministries book class with Case for a Creator. I'm your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, and I apologize again for being a little bit late today. Actually, a lot late today. I know I've been gotten a late start the last couple of weeks, and to be totally upfront with you guys, it is because I've been dealing with a back injury. So a lot of the normal activities of daily life are taking me a little bit longer. So thank you for your patience. I also just struggle, to be honest, to get started on a lot of these things. But I appreciate you guys being there. I appreciate your patience. Um, let's get into our show today. Before we hop on, I want to remind you guys that, as always, please do support the Orthodox Diocese of Alaska. They are doing good work establishing schools in the native languages up there in the north, and also they need priests for the rural villages. So please do check out the link in the description below so that you can see how to support what they're doing and learn more. Last week, we introduced Jonathan Wells and discussed the first of the icons of evolution. So we talked about what the icons of evolution are, and we talked about why this is even important. The fact that these icons of evolution are how the theory of evolution is taught. And we've been examining this idea that if these icons of evolution are how the theory of evolution gets taught, then we have to ask ourselves if these icons of evolution are valid. And if they are valid, then if the theory of evolution stands the test of scientific scrutiny, then great, we can talk about it. If the theory of evolution fails the test of scientific scrutiny, then we have to ask ourselves, is it worth holding to a theory that claims to be scientific but can't pass its own criteria? Now, the last thing we looked at last week was the first of those icons of evolution, which is the Henry Miller experiment. We saw that the Henry Miller experiment did not pass the test of science. The Henry Miller experiment, as a matter of fact, was based on faulty reasoning and based on faulty methods. And so after exposing that, now we move to Darwin's tree of life, and then we're going to look at Haeckel's embryos. So Darwin's tree of life and Haeckel's embryos are going to be our topic today. So let's get right, without further ado, let's dive right in. So on page 49, we read, "It was time to advance to the next image of evolution. One of the most recognizable icons is the drawing Darwin sketched for the origin of species to illustrate his theory that all living creatures had a common ancestor and natural selection drove the eventual development of the countless organisms we see in the modern world. To me, his sketch of the evolutionary tree encapsulated why Darwinian evolution was so compelling. It seemed to explain everything in natural history. The question, though, is whether the tree represents reality." So, Darwin's tree is the very heart of the evolutionary narrative and represents the best description of Darwin's theory of natural selection because it illustrates how Darwinism claims that there would be this common ancestor of all living things, and then this forms a tree whose branches then branch off further and further until we have lots of different creatures. And so there's been this sort of search for an elusive common ancestor. And I talked before about my main objection to this being actually the same as Stephen C. Meyer's main objection, and interestingly enough, the same as Charles Darwin himself. Charles Darwin himself said that his main doubt for this narrative came from the fossil record, because the fossil record simply does not bear out this theory. It does not bear out the idea of this Darwinian tree of life. Now, since the days of Darwin, we have found a lot more fossils. Darwin predicted that as we found more fossils, it would fill out the gaps in this tree of life. But has that actually happened? Having now over, I think it's been either almost or it has been 200 years something. Close to 200 years of time has passed since Darwin himself voiced concern about whether or not the fossil record was teasing out his theory. Let's see whether or not the Darwin's tree of life has passed the test, given the fact that we found so many more fossils. As a matter of fact, it has not. On page 50 of our book, absolutely not, came his quick reply. As an illustration of the fossil record, the tree of life is a dismal failure, but it is a very good representation of Darwin's theory. You see, Darwin believed that if a population was exposed to one set of conditions and another part of the population experienced other conditions, then natural selection could modify the two populations in different ways. Over time, one species could produce several varieties, and if these varieties continued to diverge, they would eventually become separate species. That's why his drawing was in the pattern of a branching tree. A key aspect of his theory was that natural selection would act, in his own words, slowly, accumulating slight, successive, favorable variations, and that no great or sudden modifications were possible. So Darwin's tree is a really awesome illustration of Darwin's theory. But Darwin's tree does a poor job of corresponding to what we actually see in the fossil record. So if you're going to believe Darwin's tree, the only option, if you're honest, is to believe it on blind faith, because there is no evidence for this tree. And I do have to take a moment to note the irony that very often evolutionists will criticize creationists and say that we believe in the so-called God of the gaps. But in this instance, Darwin's tree is actually the theory of the gaps, because the only argument that can ever be made really for Darwin's tree is to say that, well, someday we'll find fossils that prove the theory, or maybe animals, which we're going to get into, the objection that maybe animals who should be on the tree just weren't strong enough or weren't solid enough to have been preserved. There's various ways of getting there. We're going to address that in a minute. But I just want to point out that all of those are arguments from the gaps, not actually taking into account the evidence we have, which I'll get into what the evidence we have says. So Shahir says, can you tell me more about the survival of the fittest theory? Yeah, so the doctrine of evolution is more or less based on the idea that all living things share a common ancestor, and this common ancestor evolved over time into various species, and those species evolved over time into more species. And the central assertion is this idea expressed through Darwin's tree that all things have a common ancestor, and then this branches out from there. That's what we're talking about in this. At least that's the central claim of Darwin's tree, which is what we're talking about right now. So, and as we can see, this is all based on a theory of blind faith. There is no actual evidence for this. So what does the fossil record actually demonstrate? Well, let's find out. Starting on page 50, and I'm going to go through a little bit of page 51 here. It says, his theory, his being Darwin's theory predicts a long history of gradual divergence from a common ancestor, with the differences slowly becoming bigger and bigger until you get to the major differences we have now. The fossil evidence, even in his day, showed quite the opposite. The rapid appearance of phylum-level differences in what is called the Cambrian explosion. Darwin believed that future fossil discoveries would vindicate his theory, but that has not happened. Actually, fossil discoveries over the last 150 years have turned his tree upside down by showing the Cambrian explosion was even more abrupt and extensive than scientists thought in Darwin's day. So what we actually find is the opposite of Darwin's tree, which is why some scientists in China have started using who want to hold on to the idea of Darwin's tree, but recognize that Darwin's tree utterly fails, have said that it's more like a field of grass, like a lawn where you have different blades of grass shooting up at different places, than anything like a tree. So Darwin's tree has not been vindicated by the fossil record. It has, as a matter of fact, been totally refuted by the fossil record. So this is often called, the Cambrian explosion is often called the biological Big Bang, which is a sudden origin for most of the phyla that exist even to this day. So on page 51, we read, here's what the record shows. There were some jellyfish, sponges, and worms prior to the Cambrian. There's no evidence to support Darwin's theory of a long history of gradual divergence. You know, it's interesting, too, that another scientist, I think Michael Denning, has a book called, I might be wrong about that name, by the way, so forgive me if I'm mistaken, but there's another book called Darwinism, a Theory in, or Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And then more recently, I think in 2015, that same author came out with a book called Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis. And when I was reading Still a Theory in Crisis, it was interesting that Michael Denning argues in that book, he actually argues for the idea that all living organisms share a common ancestor. So he believes that, but he still says that Darwin's tree of life is wrong, and he still says that the Darwinian evolution paradigm is wrong because of the biological Big Bang. He says it's simply a fact that Darwin theorized that evolution could not take place rapidly, and the only way evolution could have taken place is actually to have happened very rapidly, not over the course of millions upon millions of years, but actually very rapidly. That's the only way it could have happened, because that's what the fossil record shows. And so that's someone who still disagrees with myself and other Christians, still believes in this idea of evolutionary common ancestor, but even he's saying that Darwin's tree simply does not cohere. It simply does not adhere to the factual evidence we have. So we see, like I said, a sudden, not a gradual emergence of living things. So Now the question is, what is sudden? Because sometimes when these science-minded people are talking about the term sudden, they mean, as sudden as I get on in the morning for one of these classes where I'm always like 10 minutes late. And then I suddenly am appearing, but my sudden is much to Moldy Apple's chagrin, very late compared to other people's sudden. um, Sorry, that's a little self-deprecating humor there, um, but the but these scientists often will talk about sudden, and when they say sudden, they might be talking about thousands of years. So what exactly are we talking about here? Well, on page 52 of our text, we actually see, or sorry, I didn't finish reading page 51 for you guys. So here's what the record shows: some jellyfish, sponges, and worms prior to the Cambrian. No evidence to support Darwin's theory of long gradual divergence. And then this is where I got distracted. He says, then at the beginning of the Cambrian, boom, all of a sudden we see representatives of the arthropods, modern representatives of which are insects, crabs, and the like. Ectoderms, which include modern starfish, sea urchins, chordates, which include modern vertebrates, and so forth. Mammals come later, but the chordates, the major group to which they belong, were there right from the beginning of the Cambrian. That is absolutely contrary to Darwin's tree of life. Animals which are so fundamentally different in their body plans appear fully developed all of a sudden in what paleontologists have called the single most spectacular phenomenon in the fossil record. So now this is where I'm saying, okay, but how sudden is sudden? Because when I think of sudden, I think of, instant. But when these people talk about sudden, they aren't always talking about instant. So what exactly does this mean? Well, on page 52, we have an analogy. It's a sports analogy, but what's his name? Jonathan Wells says, okay, so he mentions football. So in football, you have, for those of you who aren't from the United States, in American football, you have a football field that is 100 yards. So 100 yards from end zone to end zone, and every 5 yards there's a dash mark. Every 10 yards are thoroughly marked. And this is because every time you go 10 yards in football, you get what's called a first down. And then if you make it to the end zone, you get what's called a touchdown. And that's worth 7 points. Anyway, so I only share all that so that you can understand his analogy. So he says, imagine yourself on the goal line of a football field. So you're on one end of that 100-yard field, right just on the very end of it. You're at the goal line of the field. So the goal line is where you score. If you were the team going that direction, you would score by passing that goal line. But you're starting at the goal line, so the 1 yard line, so to speak. That line represents the first fossil, a microscopic single-celled organism. Now start marching down the field. You pass the 20-yard line, the 40-yard line, you pass midfield. You're approaching the other goal line. All you've seen this entire time are these microscopic single-celled organisms. So all the way from one end of the football field to the other end of the football field, you've seen nothing but these single-celled organisms. You come to the 16-yard line on the far end of the field. So you've gone 84 yards, 16-yard line on the other end of the field, and you see some sponges and jellyfish and worms. So this whole time there's been single-celled organisms. Now you've got some worms and jellyfish. Then, boom, in the space of a single stride, all these other forms of animals suddenly appear. As one evolutionary scientist said, the major animal groups appear in the fossil record just as Athena did from the head of Zeus, full-blown and raring to go. Now, nobody can call that a branching tree. Some paleontologists, though they think Darwin's overall theory is correct, are only willing to call it a lawn rather than a tree because you have these separate blades of grass sprouting up. One paleontologist in China says Darwin's tree stands on its head because at the top of the tree, where you have all of the living organisms, it comes first and then goes down to and then actually fans inward, not outward, because, well, anyway, that's what he says. Either way, the result is the same. The Cambrian explosion has uprooted Darwin's tree. So Darwin's tree is simply not a valid explanation. It has no explanatory force. It does not meet the scientific criteria. We've got another question here. Shahir asks again, do you really believe in the theory of revolution, or do you believe in the story of Adam and Eve? I think you mean evolution. And as I said in our first session on this series, I would encourage you to go back and watch that. I explained that I believe the sacred scriptures. I believe that there was a real Adam and a real Eve. I don't believe Darwinian theory. I don't believe in the theory of macroevolution. I do believe in, and all Christians believe in, what's called microevolution. So we all believe that various types of creatures that God has created do develop over time. This is something that God has put into the genetic makeup of creatures, is that we're able to adapt to our environment. How that plays out is something that scientists are studying and have been studying. But the problem is when we interpret that to mean that we all have a common ancestor and all this, and that's what we're seeing. Science itself does not bear out. So the question then is, as I brought up before, what if we could discover more fossils? So we've seen that the fossil record refutes this idea of Darwin's tree, but could Darwin's tree theoretically be proved by more fossils in the future? So Lee Strobel asked that question to Jonathan Wells, and on page 53, Wells answers. Wells yielded a little. As a scientist, he conceded, I have to leave open the possibility that next year someone will discover a fossil bed in the Congo or somewhere that will suddenly fill in the gaps. I nodded at his admission. However, he wasn't finished. But I sure don't think that's likely, he added. It hasn't happened after all this time, and millions of fossils have already been dug up. There are certainly enough good sedimentary rocks from before the Cambrian era to have preserved ancestors if there were any. I have to agree with two experts in the field who said that the Cambrian explosion is too big to be masked by flaws in the fossil record. So in other words, like I was kind of joking about earlier, the irony is that evolution is actually a theory of the gaps, at least in this case. The theory of macroevolution relies on us to believe that there's just a bunch of gaps in the fossil record, and that's all it is. Now, interestingly enough, when I was studying biology and all these things, my teachers always presented it the opposite way until I got into college. Once I got into college, this sort of stuff actually did get acknowledged. in a university setting, a lot of the problems with Darwinism and with macroevolution were more acknowledged in the university setting, at least when I was going to school. But in high school and things, this was just not talked about, and it was attacked. And there was this kind of, and I know some universities do this too, they really attack anybody who would criticize the theory of macroevolution. And one of the arguments that they always use is, well, you just believe in the God of the gaps. But the irony is that evolutionists are actually the ones believing in a theory of the gaps, because it's their theory that lacks any fossil evidence. And when you point that out, they have to say just what Lee Strobel said to Jonathan Wells, namely, well, maybe next year we'll find a bunch of fossils that will confirm this. Well, maybe it's possible. These are gaps. And so instead of examining the evidence that we actually have in front of us, you're postulating that there could be more evidence that we're just not seeing. And that's a theory of the gaps. Moldy Apple says, Christians believe in God. God created out of nothing, creation ex nihilo, which leads to a coherent worldview. We don't stare at pigeons in the park and work our way back. Exactly. So that's an excellent point. We do not believe in a God of the gaps. We believe in the God who created everything. And we don't have to work our way back, so to speak. Now, so then the next question is, could the Precambrian fossils be too small or too soft to be preserved? I made reference to that earlier. So before Lee Strobel asked Jonathan Wells if maybe there just are no fossil, or maybe there are fossils but we haven't found them yet, and he says, well, this problem is too big to be masked by just holes in the fossil record. But now Lee Strobel asks another question, which is another common objection. Could the Precambrian animals just have been too small? And the answer is, as for the Precambrian fossils being too tiny or soft to be preserved, well, we have microfossils of bacteria in rocks dating back more than 3 billion years. There have been soft-bodied organisms from before the Cambrian era that have been found in Australia. In fact, scientists have found soft-bodied animals in the Cambrian explosion itself. So I don't think that's a very good explanation either. Today, evolutionists are turning to molecular evidence to try to show that there was a common ancestor prior to the Cambrian era. So the fossil record preserves plenty of creatures from before the Precambrian era, so that objection simply doesn't hold water. The very fact that we have these other creatures shows that that's not a workable objection. Now, he just made reference to the fact that within molecular biology, some people are still trying to preserve this tree of life. So, can that argument hold water? Well, ultimately, what this usually comes down to is comparing similarities within the DNA or RNA, and then attempting to reconstruct a possible tree. That's what he's referencing when he talks about these molecular theories, is attempts to reconstruct a possible tree, usually through DNA or RNA. So on page 54, he responds to this. There are too many problems with this. If you compare this molecular tree with a tree based on, say, anatomy, you get a different tree. You can examine another molecule and come up with another set or a tree altogether. In fact, if you give one molecule to two different laboratories, you can get two totally different trees. There's no consistency, including with the dating. It's all over the board. Based on all this, it's reasonable for me as a scientist to say that maybe we should question the assumption that this common ancestor actually exists. This is the thing about science. Science is testable, it's repeatable, and this theory, this tree of life theory, simply is not repeatable or testable. There is no scientific basis to believe in Darwin's tree of life. In fact, the people who are trying to revive this theory on this molecular biological level, there's as many of these theories as there is people who promote it. Practically, it's not a coherent system. It doesn't produce results. It doesn't produce scientific results. It produces conjecture. So now we do have to, take this moment to concede that all different Christians and atheists and evolutionists, everybody concedes that a kind of common ancestry, in the sense that different fruit flies are all coming from one fruit fly ancestor, different finches are all coming from one finch ancestor, all human beings come from Adam and Eve. But the question is not whether microevolution takes place. The question is the ambitious claim macroevolution makes, which is that dogs and cats, humans and chimpanzees, bears and iguanas, crabs and turnips, elephants and rhinoceroses, heck, octopi, all have the same, all have one common ancestor. And that is a different question. And science says it really doesn't look like it. The evidence that we have, the best evidence that we have in front of us, it does not look like there's a common ancestor. Instead, it looks like there's this biological Big Bang, and all of these creatures suddenly emerge. They aren't just they aren't gradually produced over time through a common ancestor, as Darwin's tree promotes. I always say this is the skeptics' time to shine. Now is the time for skeptics to really show their worth. Actually examine Darwin's theory, and you'll see that Darwin's tree simply does not hold scrutiny. Oftentimes, people who call themselves skeptics are extremely hypocritical, and they're skeptics when it comes to Christianity, but then they accept Darwin's tree on blind faith, despite the fact that there is not a shred of evidence to support it. But I'm saying be a real skeptic, be a true skeptic, and reject the macroevolution theory. But now we get back to our regressive textbooks, the textbooks that are written by people who want to bask in regressive ignorance. So, Lee Strobel asks, is this drawing still featured in textbooks today? Not only is it included in textbooks, but it's called a fact, Wells replied, sounding genuinely astonished. I don't mind that it's shown. I think it's a good illustration of an interesting theory. What I do mind is that textbooks call it a fact that all animals share a common ancestor. Well, it's not a fact. If you consider all of the evidence, Darwin's tree is false as a description of the history of life. I'll even go further on that. It's not even a good hypothesis at this point. So once again, I remind you of the debate between rapper B.O.B. and science spokesman, I guess, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And in their debate, deGrasse Tyson said that he didn't care that ultimately he didn't care that B.O.B. believed in a flat earth, because it didn't really matter if he believed in a flat earth, as long as he wasn't in charge of anything. As long as he wasn't in charge of anything, if he just wants to produce rap records and all this and isn't really hurting anybody by believing it, he's quote unquote free to bask in regressive ignorance. And right here, we see another example where America's science textbooks and many Western countries' science textbooks are basking in regressive ignorance. Instead of admitting that Darwin's tree of life has been thoroughly refuted, has no evidentiary basis in science, and instead of telling people about this amazing Cambrian explosion that has thoroughly uprooted scientific theory, America's science textbooks and the Western world science textbooks want to just brush the Cambrian explosion under the rug and bask in the regressive ignorance of Darwin's tree of life. So now, speaking of basking in regressive ignorance, we move on to the second of our icons of evolution for the day, with Haeckel and his drawings of embryos. And I'm going to be totally honest with you guys. I find this to be one of the absolute lamest arguments for evolution. I really don't even understand why anybody finds this one compelling, but a lot of people do, so it's worth refuting. So basically, what Haeckel's sketches are is there was this guy named Haeckel. Let me just verify here. I think his name was Ernst Haeckel, but he was German, and he. Okay, this is funny. Moldy Apple says, I don't care if Neil wants to throw out philosophy in favor of appealing to eugenics as long as he isn't in control of anything. Yeah, that's a good point as well. That's a very good point as well, that Neil deGrasse Tyson has a lot of problematic views. And but here's the thing, I don't agree with Neil on that point. I think it's important for us to believe true things, and I think it makes us better people if our beliefs are rooted in reality. So I actually disagree with this sort of, oh, everybody should just do their own thing, man. I disagree with that perspective. And I think it is problematic if B.O.B. wants to tell people to believe in the flat earth, and then the reality is that if you want to chart a flight plan, you have to take the curvature of the earth into account. So it's problematic to be teaching these things. I also think it's problematic for Neil deGrasse Tyson to teach the false theory of Darwinian evolution and to teach eugenics and all these things, even if he's not in charge of anything. But what we're seeing is that the real problem is not that the people who aren't in charge of anything want to bask in regressive ignorance. The real problem is that the people creating our textbooks are basking in regressive ignorance. So as far as Haeckel, what Haeckel was doing is he took examples of several different creatures and showed them at the midpoint, the middle stage of their fetal development and their embryonic development, and sketched them and said, look, they look really similar when they're at this particular stage of development in the womb, so therefore evolution is true. I really find this to be an absurd argument in the first place, but The first thing I just want to say is that he's not comparing actual embryos to actual embryos. He's comparing his own sketches to his own sketches. So let's just get that out of the way right away. On page 56 of our book, it says, "When you saw these drawings, I said to Wells, did you have the same reaction that I did, that these were strong evidence for Darwinism?" "Yes, I did the first time I looked at them," Wells answered. "It wasn't until I was doing my own graduate work that I began to compare actual photographs of embryos to what Haeckel had drawn. I was stunned. They didn't fit. There was a big discrepancy. It was really hard to believe." As he described what happened, I slowly shook my head in amazement at the implications of what he was saying. I sort of rationalized by saying, well, textbooks tend to oversimplify things. But over time, it bothered me more and more. I was hungry for details, and I asked, "What is it that specifically bothered you?" He replies, "There are 3 problems with these drawings. The first is that the similarities in the early stages were faked." He leveled this accusation without emotion in his voice, but nevertheless it was a stunning charge. "Are you sure? It seemed inconceivable that the textbooks I had relied upon as a student had so blatantly misled me." To which Wells said, "You can call them fudged, distorted, misleading, but the bottom line is that they were faked. Apparently, in some cases, Haeckel actually used the same woodcut to print embryos from different classes because he was so confident in his theory that he figured he didn't have to draw them separately. In other cases, he doctored the drawings to make them look more similar than they actually are. At any rate, his drawings misrepresent the embryos." So Haeckel was not using photos. He was not using actual fact. He was not comparing actual side-by-side embryos. He was comparing his own drawings that he had distorted to make them look similar. I also point out that I really don't think, one of the reasons I really don't think this is a very good argument is because I don't really see why it matters. People in different stages of development do not have different value. So as the great science writer, Dr. Not Dr. Strange. Oh shoot. What was his name now? Dr. Seuss. As the great science writer Dr. Seuss said, "A person is a person, no matter how small." So it really doesn't matter to me, this argument that, well, at this stage of development, a person looks strikingly similar to a dog. Who cares? At this stage of, if somebody splashes acid on somebody else's face, then that person who has had acid splashed on their face looks totally different than they did before. I don't think that makes them any less human. I don't think that makes them any. I really don't care about this argument. It's so ridiculous to me. But but let's look at it. That's my personal thing. A more scientific way of addressing it is that it's simply not true. If you compare actual photos of embryos side by side, they don't look nearly as similar as Haeckel is trying to assert. That's amazing. I said, how long has this been known? That's Lee Strobel. To which Jonathan Wells says, they were first exposed in the late 1860s when his colleagues accused him of fraud. Notice that 1860s, they were accusing Haeckel of fraud for making these doctored sketches that did not correspond to reality. I cocked my head. Wait a minute, I saw these drawings in books I studied when I was a student in the late 1960s and 70s. I saw them in textbooks in the 2000s when I was in school as well. More than 100 years later, how is that possible? It's worse than that, he declared. They're still being used, even in upper division textbooks on evolutionary biology. In fact, I analyzed graded 10 recent textbooks on how accurately they dealt with this topic. I had to give 8 of them an F. 2 others did only slightly better, and I gave them a D. Anger was brewing inside of me. I had bought into Darwinism and subsequently atheism partially on the basis of drawings that scientists had known for a century were doctored. This is really hard to believe, I said. Doesn't it make you mad? Of course it does. Because I was raised on this stuff too. I was misled, he said. There was no excuse for it. When some biologists exposed this in an article a few years ago, the evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard complained that this was nothing new. He had known about it for 20 years. It was no secret to the experts. But then why was it in textbooks? Even Gould said textbooks writers should be ashamed of the way these drawings have been mindlessly recycled for over a century. At least he was honest enough to call it what it is, the academic equivalent of murder. So the evolution emperor has no clothes, and it's no wonder when I was in science class, they didn't want any questions or challenges being put forth. It's no wonder that when I was in high school science class in the early 2000s, my science teacher yelled at me that I believed a backwards book that said that a whale was a fish, instead of actually dealing with any of my objections to what he was saying. It's no wonder that atheists are snarky on their little internet videos and in comment sections, because they don't have any actual evidence. All they have is snarkiness and anger and rage, because their whole theory is a house of cards built on sinking sand. And it is exposed for what it is, which is false and misleading. And Haeckel's embryos are a key example, a prime example of the dishonesty of the macroevolution hypothesis. In addition to straight up lies, he carefully selected and cherry picked the examples he would be using, as well as of different animals, as well as cherry picking the example stages of development. And that's really important. You see, what Haeckel was doing is he would take the embryos of animals and creatures that look the most similar as embryos, ignoring examples that look more different, and then only show them at the stage in which they look most similar to another one at that stage, not showing them throughout the process of their embryonic development where they really don't look similar at all. For example, his most famous rendition has 8 columns. 4 are mammals, but they are all placental mammals. There are 2 other kinds of mammals that he didn't even show, which are different. The remaining 4 classes he showed are reptiles, birds, amphibians, and fish, which happen to be more similar than the ones he omitted. He used a salamander to represent amphibians instead of a frog, which looks different. So he stacked the deck by picking representatives that came closest to fitting his idea, and then went further by faking the similarities. So it's an example of not so natural selection. He didn't select his examples at random. He intentionally selected the examples that would do the best to make his point. But that's not how science works. Science doesn't say, I'm only going to examine the data that fits my own paradigm. Science says I'm going to take in as much evidence as possible and then try to come to a conclusion from it. But also, it's presented as early stages of development, but this is not true. Wells moved to the edge of his chair. Clearly, this was tapping into his passion. To me, as an embryologist, the most dramatic problem is that what Haeckel claimed as the early stage of development is nothing of the sort. It's actually the midpoint of development. If you go back to the earlier stages, the embryos look far more different, but he deliberately omits the early stages altogether. So, what Jonathan Wells is referencing is what's called the embryonic hourglass. He explains that here. But embryologists talk about the developmental hourglass, which refers to the shape of an hourglass with its width representing the measure of difference. You see, vertebrate embryos start out looking very different at the earliest stages of cell division. In mammals, for example, are radically different. Cell division in mammals are radically different from those in any other classes. There are no possible way you could mix them up. In fact, it's extremely different even within classes. The patterns are all over the place. Then there's the midpoint, which is when Haeckel chimed in and claimed that his drawings are the early stage. And it's at that point that the embryos become more similar, though nowhere near as similar as Haeckel claimed. And then they become more different yet again. So what we see, this developmental hourglass is so important because it actually contradicts Darwin's claim. The reason Haeckel made these drawings is because Darwin had made a claim that he believed that a creature would trace its evolutionary history in its embryonic development. And so Haeckel was trying to say that this does in fact happen. But what we see is that in embryonic development, this developmental hourglass clearly shows that there is no tracing back in imagined evolutionary history. It's merely the development of a miracle inside of the womb. So the excuse that's often made for leaving this drawing in textbooks instead of taking it out is, quote, the drawings are false, but the concept is basically true, end quote. The problem is that the concept isn't basically true. It's not true at all. The actual embryos that are actually studied by embryologists contradict Haeckel's claim and contradict Darwinism. So Haeckel's entire argument is based on nothing. Now, there's one more thing that we need to address, and that is a lot of people claim that during the development of human embryos, there's a short period in which human embryos have quote unquote gill-like structures, and then those structures go away. Jonathan Wells says, let me be clear, they are not gills. Even fish don't have gills at that stage. In humans, the ridges become one thing. In fish, they become gills. They're not even gill slits. To call them gill-like structures is reading evolutionary theory back into the evidence. They are never gill-like except in the superficial sense that they are lines in the neck area. British embryologist Leo Walport said the resemblance is only illusory. So the reality is you'll sometimes hear this, although you don't hear this claim so much anymore, but you do sometimes hear people say that in the womb, humans have gills for a really short period of time. That's simply not true. Humans do develop small ridges on the neck, and but they never are anything even remotely similar to gills. They're not just skin folds, they're a little bit more complicated than just skin folds, but they're never gill like in any sense, other than the superficial sense of being ridges on the neck, which is what you could theoretically say that gills are. But they're not gills. So that's two more evolutionary icons down. Next, we're going to be looking at what I've always found to be a really funny one, which is the wing flipper leg and hand pick bones. And then after that, we're going to be talking about human genes and ape genes and the Archaeopteryx. But I think next week is probably going to be just the discussion of the wing flipper leg hand thing and maybe the human genes and ape genes. I don't know how much we're going to get to next week, but be ready for that. However, I just want to end with this simple note. As we study these things, hopefully, if you're truly a person with a skeptical mind, if you're truly a person who cares about science and truly a person who cares about evidence, then hopefully you're seeing that the macroevolution theory simply doesn't hold water. And I'm glad that you're seeing that. But if that's something you're seeing, then I want you to know that don't just reject evolution, embrace the Lord Jesus Christ. Come to the divine liturgy and experience a relationship with God. Christianity isn't just about knowing correct facts and information. It's about having a relationship with the true and living God. And so I pray for you that that's what you'll experience. And so come partake of that relationship with the living God who loves you and delights in you. He delights in all of your skepticism and all of your questions. Feel free to write your questions in the comments below, but don't miss out on a relationship with the true and living God. So thank you very much for watching. Please do share this with your friends, especially your friends who believe in Darwinian evolution, so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.